My name is Uzair Yunus, and this is the last session of our two-day conference. And I think, at least from my point of view, we saved the most important conversation for the end, because you've heard people talk about, and I'll get to Kapil is like, what do you mean? We've talked about economic frictions at this conference. We've talked about untargeted subsidies and their role. We've talked about what do market reforms look like? Why don't they happen in Pakistan? We talked about artificial intelligence earlier this morning, and the role of middle powers and what middle powers aspire or want to do in this evolving geopolitical order. But in the context of any economy, advanced or developing, a resilient energy ecosystem, an energy ecosystem that does not provide cheap, reliable access to energy molecules from natural gas, coal, renewable energy, hydropower, into the grid, into people's homes or industrial manufacturing units, et cetera, that country cannot do anything that we've discussed so far in this conference. So we're going to be talking about how can Pakistan build a more resilient energy ecosystem in an era of climate disaster. My personal view is there is an energy crisis in Pakistan, has been for a long period of time, but that crisis is also an opportunity to leapfrog ahead, to really change the human development trajectory in the country. So joining us today are Ghazala Mansuri, lead economist, poverty reduction and equity group at the World Bank, Ammar, who's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and a friend of mine who engages frequently in gham hours with me at all ends of the day on WhatsApp, including a very famous chart he once shared with me about how best to describe Pakistan's energy access challenge, which is per capita consumption of energy in Pakistan has basically remained flat for the last 5 to 7 years. And that in itself is an indication of the human development challenge, which Ghazala will talk about. Erum Haider is Assistant Professor of Political Science and Environmental Studies at the College of Wooster. Erum has done some fantastic work on privatization of energy companies in Pakistan and its implications, both good and bad. A lot of bad that people don't often think about in the mainstream discourse about privatization. And then last but not least is Alisa Newman, Executive Vice President and General Counsel at Excelerate Energy, which is a large global energy player and one of the major international companies operating in Pakistan's energy ecosystem. So we will hear from Alisa about how Excelerate has found itself doing business in Pakistan, what works, what should work better, and case studies from global markets in terms of what Pakistan could replicate as well. So I'll jump right in first with you, Ghazala, because I want to start with the human side of this conversation, which is we've had terrible floods. The work Ammar and I did in 2022 sort of indicated about $30 billion, give or take a few, in terms of loss and damages and reconstruction costs. Setback, I remember having a conversation with a friend of mine in the education system who said households were barely recovering from the 2011 floods, and then the 2022 ones came along. So help the audience understand the broader human development crisis in Pakistan, and how does that link to access to energy and the implications of a weak and inefficient energy ecosystem in the country.
Great. So I'll actually do this in 3 steps. The first is what's happening on climate. The second is what's happening on human capital, and then what's our energy status today, and then kind of how is that going to be linked? Yeah? So just very quickly, first, I think there's this tendency to just talk about climate change. We don't have a climate change crisis only. We have a climate and environmental crisis. It's absolutely critical to understand, right? We have not contributed, we can legitimately claim, to the climate crisis, in that we have not been big contributors on the greenhouse gas emissions. We have on the environmental side. And I'm going to tell you how it's really the environmental degradation that is actually augmenting the damage risk from extreme weather events, right? So it's not just climate change is happening and then you have these extreme weather events. It's everything to do with what we've done to the environment. There's good news here, which is that that's a part we can fix. And if we fix that, we could actually potentially ex ante reduce a good bit of the risk from climate, right? And I think that good news part is really important when we talk about this, because often it's just doom and gloom, right? Okay, so that's one. So what's going on with the climate? There are two basic things we have to worry about. There's going to be a rise in temperature, right? Pakistan belongs in a region where it's going to see higher than the global average rise in temperature, and the hydrological cycle is going to be disrupted, right? So you're going to have, in Pakistan's case, you're going to have more precipitation, more intense precipitation, uncertain precipitation. The monsoons will become very chaotic. We rely on the monsoon for entire agricultural productivity. That's going to become uncertain. We saw this in 2022 where the monsoon changed its direction, right? That's something that's expected. Changing directions, uncertainty of timeline. That, just keep in mind, that's a huge implication for agricultural productivity, right? And then we'll have glacial melt. What does that do? That's going to eventually, in the initial phase, give us a lot more water flowing through the Indus River system. But then eventually, we may want to worry about how much we want to invest in hydropower, because the Indus River basin's water flow is also at risk, right? Once the glaciers melt. Now, there is an idea that there'll be more precipitation rather than snow, and that has a lot of significance for the timing, again, of things. We rely on this kind of very particular timing of when there's glacial melt and when we start our seasons and so forth. That is likely to change, right, as the glaciers melt. So that's sort of the backdrop of climate change. So now you have these extreme heat events, right, and precipitation events happening, right? What are they interacting with on the ground? So you have incredibly degraded land in Pakistan. This is not just Pakistan, everywhere, right? We've deforested, we've destroyed our pastures through unmanaged grazing over a long period of time. We've done this conventional agriculture, which has basically reduced the organic content of our soils. I had some plots tested, actually about 300 plots tested from Punjab last year when I was doing my climate report. And the carbon content in those plots was about 0.04 and 0.3 and 0.4, right? You need about 3% organic matter in the soil for soil to be alive. What does that mean? If that's low, at least 1%, this is way below 1%, you're very, very, very close to aridification at this point, right? So arid, so close that applications of fertilizer are not likely to be helpful. So we are dumping a lot of fertilizer on the soil, getting absolutely almost nothing for it, right? And yet the debate is, how can I get more fertilizer? How can I get cheaper fertilizer? It's not doing nothing at this point.
And cheaper gas for that fertilizer.
To make that fertilizer, right? So we've got enormously aridified land. That alone means that the soil cannot infiltrate water, right? It's too hard. There's no gap in it. It cannot infiltrate water. What does that do? Rain falls, very intense amount of rain falls. Either if it can, it flows very rapidly away, as happened in the hill torrents, right? In Rajanpur and DG Khan. So it fell off the hill torrents, nowhere, it just comes down, crashing down, no trees, completely depleted. That whole area has been heavily deforested. All the natural rainfall catchments that existed have been destroyed, right? So the rain comes crashing down, there's a depression, the Indus is at high tide, you have a massive flood, right? So we did this, right? I mean, this is not climate change in a way. So I'm just reinforcing this, right? That at the same time, we've completely there's an incredibly wasteful use of water. So at the same time, we are massively polluting our water. What does that mean? The groundwater is the reserve that you need for when you have droughts, right? When you don't have water. But we don't have groundwater reserves. In fact, we are not just depleting them, we are contaminating what little remains, right? Industrial effluent, agricultural runoff from nitrates from fertilizer, and of course sewage, untreated sewage everywhere, right? So your groundwater, once it gets contaminated, it can be a long time fixing that, right? If your groundwater level gets very depressed, long time fixing that, right? So we have very deep problems, deep crises. And a part of me thinks that while we are thinking about all these current polycrises, we are actually not attending to the fact that what's coming, is going to be far, far worse, right? So, very famously, someone has said that you're basically 7 meals away from social chaos. Not to dramatize this, but honestly, one should dramatize this, right? 7 meals away from social chaos, land is degraded. I mean, look at what happened. Last year, we saw a very good example of that. You had floods, but before the floods, what did we have? An unseasonable heat wave that destroyed a big chunk of the wheat crop. We had fires that destroyed some of our pine and other forests, right? And then we had immediately following that, we had this big monsoon. The same pattern occurred in 2010. You had a massive heat wave and then this, right? So there's a cycle here. There's an interrupted hydrological cycle that's causing all this. And so, it's not just that there's climate change. That's what I want to make now. Moving from there to human capital very quickly. I don't think I have to tell this audience too much about the fact that Pakistan is doing very dismally on human capital already. We have a serious human capital problem. We talked all day yesterday about productivity, but where are you going to get productivity from with your human capital crisis, right? So if you look at school enrollment, if you look at secondary school, only 38% enrollment of girls, right? The rest of the region is at 60%. If you look at net enrollment in primary, we are around 60, 65%. The rest of the region, 62%. The rest of the region is at 90, right? So that's how far behind we are in education. On child stunting, it's just dismal, 40%, right? In Sindh, 50%. In rural Sindh, 65%. Okay?
65% of children are stunted.
Correct. What does that mean? So it's not a height issue, as Asim was talking about.
He was worried about his 2 inches.
Yes. There is a height deficit. There is a height deficit that you carry into adulthood, but that's not the problem, right? There's actually very good research showing that longevity is inversely related to height. So I'm really serious. There is very good research on this, right? That is not the problem, right? What is the problem is the fact that stunting means primarily cognitive decline, right? 80% of brain development occurs between 0 and 2. If you are stunted, you have essentially you have cognitive damage, you have immune dysfunction, which is what's driving stunting actually, is this immune dysfunction, right? So you have, and we can, I can talk for 1 hour about that, I will not, okay, because that's an area I work on, but it's basically immune dysfunction, it's cognitive decline, and it's physical weakness, right? I want you to keep that in mind with climate change, because that's really important. So you become physically very weak as an adult, you earn less, you learn less as a child, you have a lot of illnesses you're susceptible to, right? So there's diabetes, cardiovascular disease, blood pressure, in fact, all of the whole plethora of immune diseases you're more susceptible to as an adult. 65% of children currently in Sindh, right, are in that condition, and the heat level is rising and is going to rise more than the global average, right? So even if the planet acts in a very orderly way on climate and rapidly, which is showing no sign of doing, as we can see, right? Neither orderly nor rapid, we're going to get an unusual increase in temperature, right? But if you have a physically incapacitated population, right, that going into that sort of environment, that's super risky, right? And then, of course, compound the risks for the same vulnerable population with air pollution. So your health risks, the health risks are enormous, actually, right? So this is sort of the landscape we're in. Energy, how does it relate to that? So if you think about it, with the higher temperature, you're going to need, first of all, more demand for cooling. Otherwise, we are done, right? So there's a temperature, there's a wet bulb temperature at which the human body cooks, right? We reached that in Jacobabad in 2022. Okay, we've crossed and reached that temperature, right? So you're going to need a lot of demand for cooling. And it's not just reliable or resilient energy. You're going to need universal access to that energy, to cooling systems. Food systems, you're going to need cold chains that actually work, storage systems that actually work, because agricultural production is going to be at very high risk, right? I mean, the fundamental problem actually is a different one, which is you need to cool the system. And green cover cools systems, right? This is not an energy issue, but it's absolutely vital. It's not just about fixing your energy problem. You need to cool the system. What you cool the system with is green cover on the soil, green cover through trees, and restoring your water and hydrological cycle. This, if we did, we would cool the whole system down, which means less risk to agriculture, less risk to human bodies, less risk for cooling, and all of that, right? But that's a parallel discussion. So you need reliable energy, right? Currently, even where people have access to the grid, most people don't have access 8+ hours a day. This is through the year, right? 68% everywhere, and 75% in rural areas. 8+ hours of no energy, right? when there's summertime peak demand, the whole system crashes routinely. 2020, what happened in the heat wave in 2022? There were just like rolling shortages. Of course, price of energy was unusually high. It was a difficult time. But we cannot predict that such difficult times won't come. Almost half our energy is imported, right? So if the world is in a crisis and then we're relying on so that's the argument I feel. I'm going to stop in a minute here, which is that I think it's not just about reliable energy. We need to move to domestic energy sources, which means that we have to move to renewable. We don't have a choice in this matter, right? But we've got very good research showing that it is the most cost-effective option right now for further investment, right? So I think that there is good news even here. Yes, it's going to cost, but I'll leave you with one thought. We waste an incredible amount of money right now on energy, right? We know this. 8 billion in subsidies, 8 billion in lost output due to shortages and these kinds of outages, 15 billion in the circular debt. I mean, it's just a story of, it's just a disaster, right? So if we get rid of all of that, 2.6 billion, another 2.6 billion on bad agricultural subsidies, right? There's a ton of money that is just being extremely badly deployed that could be deployed towards renewable and towards fixing what's wrong with agriculture and cooling the system. So let me stop here for a minute.
Thank you for that overview, and I think it's a good segue into Ammar's points related to access to cheap and reliable energy. Something I'll point out as a fun fact that he and I were chatting. It was 3 a.m. I remember in Pakistan, and I was like having my lunch break. And there was this data that had come out of unaccounted for gas, UFG as it's called in the energy ecosystem. And we did a very quick math. The total amount of unaccounted for gas in terms of cost in dollars roughly came to, I think, 500,000 children's education every year. That's how much was just literally evaporating through leakages in the system or lack of collecting in the ecosystem. So Ammar, you and I have talked a lot about how do we build that reliable, cheap, universally accessible ecosystem. We've talked about one of the things you all frequently mention is decentralized grids, the use of solar. How does that play a role? So help the audience understand, like in this crisis that Ghazala just described, what can be a future ecosystem to deal with this challenge and catastrophe?
Yeah, thank you, sir. I really find difficult to find people who are more bearish than me. Ghazala is definitely more bearish than me. The same points, but with the whole agriculture and the heredity thing, I think we've discussed a lot about stunting and malnutrition, how whatever we're talking about is completely useless when we can't even feed our population. It's as simple as if you can't feed people, there's no point in talking about anything else at this point. So, yep, these are existential issues, and whatever polycrisis we talk about doesn't really matter if we are not able to figure out the existential issues. So what's happening with energy right now? Again, the biggest problem, I would say the fundamental problem in Pakistan in some of the pure energy economics, it's just a single buyer model. There's a state, there's a government of Pakistan which says, I just want to buy all the energy, and I'm going to be the master planner and allocate who gets how much energy and at what price. This fundamentally leads to inefficient allocation of resources, inefficient allocation of electricity, and obviously your subsidy bill increases. Now, again, that also leads to something what I call a heartland strategy, which essentially means you start industrializing in areas which were not really areas that were supposed to be industrialized. You can have an agricultural area, but through subsidies, through cross subsidies, you created an environment where industrial activity started happening there, but it wasn't really supposed to happen there. So it leads to a lot of inefficient allocation of resources. That leads to more problems. That leads to circular debt. That leads to subsidy. That leads to a lot of money that's simply wasted. So what we need here is decentralization. We need to move from a single buyer model to a multi-buyer model, to where you and I or any household can essentially become a producer and a buyer of electricity at the same time. It is possible through solar now. We spend around 50, I was talking to Erum yesterday, around 50% of all domestic electricity connections are essentially lifeline customers. Lifeline meaning anyone who consumes less than 200 kilowatt hours of electricity. Now these are like small households, poor households, and most of them don't even get the electricity. Instead of subsidizing them all, how about you equip them to solarize their households as much as possible? That can be a policy decision. they will essentially become producers of electricity. But then that would effectively hurt monopoly of the state, where it wants to control everything from the supply to the price. And when you want to control everything from the supply to the price, from the demand to the price, that leads to more inefficient allocation. So you will keep doling out subsidies, you will keep doling out subsidies to households, to exporters, to non-exporters, and basically the price of electricity will keep on increasing. I always say this, Pakistan does not have a demand problem, electricity demand problem. It does not even have an electricity supply problem. It has a distribution and pricing problem. All electricity in the country is essentially priced on a cost-plus basis, which means there are certain costs of producing electricity. You add on top multiple layers, on top multiple taxes, multiple levies, so on and so forth. Suddenly the amount increases. So you would say, when you're setting a power plant, you would say, okay, you know what, cost-plus looks good right now. So let's just index it to the dollar as well. If the dollar increases in value against the PKR, the price is going to increase. So no one takes a 5-year, 10-year view, but when it starts increasing, like right now, prices are around 50 to 55 rupees per unit of electricity, or I would say that's about 20 to 25 cents per unit, which is much higher than most developed countries in the world. So in an economy which has a per capita income of about, what, $1,400, you're pricing electricity which is much higher than even developed markets.
And sorry to interrupt, but a third of that cost, is your math has shown, is taxes.
A third of that cost is just taxes. Why is that taxes? Because the government is not able to ensure that its budget is in order, so it keeps financing that fiscal deficit through more taxes on electricity. So what we've done over the last few years is essentially we have priced out pretty much everyone in the market from electricity. The electricity is so expensive now that the demand for that doesn't exist, and that's what we have seen over the last 6 to 7 years, that the per capita demand for electricity has actually been flat, which essentially means that you're not growing, no industrialization is happening, no services are being generated, no new services are being generated, not a lot of new stuff is happening, and there is largely static growth. So if you want any kind of productivity increase, you need some reliable, stable solution to electricity. There are solutions available. We've got the capacity, we've got the demand. The link that no one has focused on in the last, I would say, 15 or even 20 years is essentially transmission and distribution. 100 electrons that are generated by a power plant, by the time they reach someone's house, there are only 80 left. Another 5 to 6 go down because of theft or something. But you still have to pay for those 100 electrons. So that inefficiency of 20 to 25 electrons that are lost, someone has to pay for it, and that just keeps on accumulating over millions of households over many years. More than that, I think when we talk about energy, either we exclusively focus on electricity. What we really need to do is look at the full value chain. Well, a molecule or an electron, its job is to energize something. A gas molecule can do the same, and electricity electron can do the same. Its job is to just energize. How do we most efficiently generate output from that one electron or one molecule? That should be the question. 30% of our import bill is essentially fuel. If you further break it down, a lot of people think that's essentially imported fuel for electricity generation. It's not. About like 25% of total imports is just automobile fuel, which we are essentially burning away, and which has a lot of climate externalities, so on and so forth. And within that, so let's say if we import about $20 billion of fuel, about $10 billion of fuel is just for motorcycles. So you sell, Atlas Honda, which is one of the biggest motorcycle manufacturers in the country, sells about 1 million bikes every month. 1 million bikes. That's a big enough number. But they keep on selling those bikes. Now, you need policy action where that fuel that's imported can essentially be redirected in a way that you double down on public transport infrastructure, so that the demand that is being generated for that fuel slowly goes down. Again, these are policy interventions that can happen that don't even require a lot of capital investment, that just needs the government to coordinate between private markets and essentially give some kind of a public transportation infrastructure. So again, a lot of things that can be done, a lot of things that can be done on the energy front. Gas is one thing. My household bill for gas, I probably get the cheapest gas in the world right now at my household, it's priced at about $1 per MMBTU. The global market clearing price would be, let's say, around $11 or $12 per MMBTU. Why am I getting gas for $1 per MMBTU? When 60% of the country is already using LPG, which is 3 times more expensive than piped gas. So these are pricing distortions. A lot of argument is that, they're the protected households, they're poor households, but a lot of those poor households are essentially using LPG. They do not even have access to piped gas. So, as Ghazala mentioned, there are a lot of subsidies as a result of pricing inefficiency that continues to distort the market. And that over the last, I would say, 8 to 10 years, that has led to a scenario where state is essentially monopolizes pretty much every segment, whether that's banking, whether that's energy, whether that's any sector you name it, there will either be a state or some state-owned entity or some state-supported entity. With this kind of infrastructure, you can't really expect private markets to operate and some kind of price discovery to happen. All of that inefficiency is funded through subsidies, and now we've hit a point where you cannot subsidize it anymore unless we want hyperinflation to happen. So we are at a pretty critical juncture at this point. Let's see.
Okay. Thanks for that overview. And in a way, what you were describing, I think Ammar said it earlier this morning, it's the land of Mordor, and the orcs are standing in the way, so to speak. I love that Lord of the Rings reference. Erum, jumping over to you, you've done a lot of research on privatization, state-owned enterprises, a lot of conversation right now happening in Pakistan that, PIA and others, but a lot of the big issues are in the energy, electricity transmission and distribution side. Share with the audience about your own research into this topic and what does it show, particularly around what tends to happen or what the experience of consumers in Karachi has been when K Electric was privatized, and now its exit obviously is in limbo, which was a question yesterday as well. What does the data show from your research?
Thank you, Zair, and thank you for organizing such a great panel where I think all of our comments are kind of seamlessly flowing into each other. I want to put us in the Pakistan of the 1990s. Back then, the thing that we were the most concerned about is that we are spending far too much money on gas imports for these independent power plants that we've set up, right? So government policy said, what's going to be a great way to generate more energy, to get some productivity into the system, let's set up all these IPPs. It bought electricity from these independent power plants at a fixed cost that was non-negotiable. So it was committed to paying a certain amount every time. And the crisis in the 90s and the early 2000s was you are paying so much, you are in the circular debt, you are in huge energy debt. Let's rationalize distribution. That was what everybody from ADB to the IMF to everybody was saying, rationalize distribution. When you have electricity going into a grid, make sure you are recovering what you are sending out there, right? Let's make sure that you are prioritizing high-value consumers, you're prioritizing industry, you're prioritizing households that can and want to pay for energy. Great. It took a little while, but we got there. In 2008, Karachi, the state-owned KESC, had a recovery rate of 36%. In 2019, 10 years after it went over to the private equity firm that took it over in 2009, the recovery rate was over 80%. Success, right? What's the problem? Let's all just go home. What we have learned in the last few days, I think, is that looking at that access to and universal access to energy, these just weren't conversations we were having 2 decades ago. And I feel like the policies that we put in place are almost on this lag. The infrastructure we built, the momentum we got was in such a particular direction. When it came to getting people to adopt to a pay-for-use, everybody was talking about that. And now suddenly we're trying to reconcile those systems with, we can't leave people behind, right? And so here's where the gap is coming in. It's like the information we have and the really good work that people sitting here are doing is just not reaching the right sort of ears, right? We're still in that, at least in Pakistan, I feel, we're still in that old mindset. You go and talk to somebody in Karachi right now at K Electric or at the Energy Ministry, whatever else they might say about climate change, they are so singularly focused on the pay for use. I don't mind that. I just want there to be some imagination. I want them to realize that your pay-for-use system means that poor households that can't afford to pay for use are going to suffer. And this is a crisis. This is a crisis for the vulnerable. This is a crisis for children, for pregnant women, for the elderly. They have nowhere to go. They are baking inside their houses. And there is some skepticism about whether we could pull this off, right? For example, you have sort of Meera Mahadevan's work in Bihar saying that anytime you do reform, there's political interference. The remarkable thing about Karachi's electricity reform that it seemed to have worked. Right, so I already gave you stats about the recovery improvement. Industrial recovery in Karachi in the space of a decade went to 100%. Right, so this private equity firm that has invested in the electricity company in Karachi is recovering more money than the state ever did in that system. So great, things are doing really well. The open secret is that they have managed this by prioritizing service delivery to consumers who can and are willing to pay. Right? This is not a bug, this is a feature. So that the income to outage graph in Karachi is a downward sloping curve. Higher income households report fewer outages. A high income household in Karachi, where my mom lives in Clifton, receives about 2 hours of outage in peak summer. A low income household in a low priority neighborhood gets about 8 hours of the outage in peak summer. And 10, 20 years ago, this was the goal, right? How did the Pakistani state and its private subsidiary achieve this reward and reprimand system? This is a politically very difficult thing to do. And a lot of the questions I get is, well, how do we replicate this? So I was like, hold on, before you go replicating this somewhere else, let's try and understand how we did this here and whether we actually want that, right? Like, let's dig a little deeper. What happened is Karachi Electric, as a private entity, and it's partially private, right? So again, like this whole privatization thing is a little misleading. 60% of the shares are privately held, and then the rest are sort of held by the government. But it really has a lot of autonomy. And this is remarkable. The political parties agreed to let K Electric do its thing. In a country where we talk about corruption and patronage and political interference, the most competitive city in the country, the parties kind of step back and they're like, all right, do your thing. At least it seemed like that on the surface, okay? How did it do its thing? It divided the city into good and bad neighborhoods. Let's say I'm a private energy firm. Targeting outages at the individual consumer level is costly. In a city of 20 million people, it's prohibitively expensive. So what do? I take advantage of the fact that the market sorts homeowners and renters into high and low income neighborhoods. So if my mother and all her neighbors pay their bills, the electricity company calls it a low loss, a low revenue loss area, and prioritizes it when there are these rolling blackouts. And at least the people who are paying their bills should be protected. I don't need to tell you what the obvious downside of this is. If there's somebody who is in a neighborhood where her neighbors are not paying their bills, like let's say the person who works at my mother's house, she lives sort of a mile away. She's in a neighborhood where she pays her bills regularly, but her neighbors don't. So as an electricity company, I'm like, well, I'm going to look at the aggregate. There's a 60% loss from here. We have some good customers, but the majority don't pay their bills. Let's deprioritize this area when we are making these choices on where to target the blackouts, okay? Again, to iterate that this is the company with given full political sort of leverage, given free rein to do whatever it wants, this is the best system it came up with. And I'm not saying there aren't things there are plenty of things that I like about how it did things, but in its infinite resource and wisdom, this is the system we came up with. How to minimize costs and the burden on a distribution or a revenue collection firm, and how to maximize how much electricity is targeted to people who are willing to pay for it. And I want to be clear that my work is not a history of K Electric, or for that matter, Abraj. I'm interested in, as many people are in my field, on what impact certain forms of private reform have on political behavior. So I want to talk about one thing very quickly, right? I want to tell you a little story about how the removal of political influence from the distribution of electricity impacted citizens, because that's some of the work that one of chapters of my book look at. I spoke to a community of light industrial owners in Karachi in 2019 who had worked with the electricity firm to remove pirated connections from their neighborhood. They reported that things went well for a couple of months, and then the outages started, 2 hours, 4 hours. This is a group of metal workers, right? So they make these sheets for roofing, the corrugated iron. Every hour of outage is lost revenue. One of the members of the association goes to K Electric's office and complains. They are told that the residential neighborhood next to them has rampant theft. So they've been clustered into a high loss area. Something similar happens to a group of middle-class residents. They organize to clean up their neighborhood, get rid of theft, enforce compliance. A few months later, they're told that the neighborhood several streets away is stealing from them because they have uninterrupted supply and they don't, right? The private firm, it turns out, relies on citizens to police electricity. So remember those costs I talked about how am I as a private firm going to target you as an individual? I don't. I externalize those costs to you. So if you are stealing from him, I ask you to report to me, and then maybe I'll do something about it or not, right? But this is an externalization of the information costs of the system. This is a costly system. In the period before privatization, this gap in information was made up by employees of the state, street-level bureaucrats, local politicians, and political entrepreneurs. So Adam Auerbach and others talk about this work in India. This tier of individuals provides an interface of knowledge. In the absence of this tier, to whom do citizens make claims? And why would a private firm be responsive to this constituency? It's very responsive to its consumer base, which is high income, high volume consumers, industrial consumers. Why would it be answerable to people who barely consume anything, who it can aggregate into these silos and then punish them with 8 hours of outage? So I'll quickly wrap up here. I want to bring this example of Karachi's experiment with private electricity into context of what we're talking about. First, absent meaningful participation without accountable government, most reforms that we end up doing in the energy sector end up serving the elite. I would love to tell you that some middle-class, middle-income groups in Karachi are thriving because of the reforms K Electric underwent. I know plenty of high-income neighborhoods that are doing well, but middle and low-income households that lack the ability to sort themselves into these designated good neighborhoods will end up stuck. Second, the story of privatization in Karachi feels like an enormous lost opportunity, but it's not too late. KE invested in better information systems. We now have pinpointed locations for every step-down transformer. It's on my laptop, right? Like we have these systems in front of us. We shouldn't be afraid to say that we are now in an entirely different world. Great, we needed pay-for-use 2 decades ago when we wanted to rationalize the system. Now we can bring renewables on board. Now we can put green cover. We can make better sort of cooler houses, right? We can invest in architecture. Finally, environmental justice is going to be the issue of our lifetimes. We've already said this. 2 hours of electricity outage may not seem like much, but 2 hours of outage in 100-degree weather inside a house with bad ventilation, no backup power, this is a crisis. So I'll stop there, but I just want to say that there's so much we can do with the data that K Electric has collected, but I think we should also start critically examining this pay-for-use and saying, okay, is this really what we need right now? Can there be other priorities that we bring back? Thank you.
Thank you for that and sharing that case study, Erum. I'll move now to Alisa. You obviously are an external foreign direct investment participant in Pakistan's energy ecosystem, but Excelerate is also a global company. So share with the audience like the broader energy outlook from your vantage point and what that looks like. And also, what has the experience been like in participating in the Pakistani market as an international investor? What has worked, what hasn't worked, and what would you like to see change, let's say, in post-election scenario?
Sure, thank you. Well, perhaps I'll start by taking the discussion a little bit upstream. We've talked quite a bit about power generation, and I think when we think of power generation, we think of, importantly, of building power plants, installing turbines. But the real cost of providing power is the feedstock. So perhaps I'll just take a minute just to give a bit of a snapshot and paint sort of the energy or the feedstock picture in Pakistan today, recognizing that this is dynamic and this is probably not where we're going to be 10 years from now. So currently, Pakistan power is generated about 40% from natural gas, about 25% from hydropower, about 12, this varies, but about, let's say, 12% from coal, about 10% from diesel, fuel oil, and other crude oil derivative products, keeping in mind that those two categories, coal and oil for power generation, are, of course, the most polluting. And then about 10% from nuclear and about 5% from renewables. So again, as we think about the climate conversation, right now in Pakistan, as in many other developing countries, renewables is a very small piece of the let's say, the energy pie. If we were to break down those numbers further, that gas that provides, natural gas that provides 40% of Pakistan's energy, about 80% is from indigenous resources, so Pakistan's own onshore and offshore natural gas reserves, and 20% is imported. When a country considers options to import natural gas, they historically had only one, which was pipelines from neighboring countries. Pakistan historically and currently does not rely on pipeline gas. There has been a talk of a pipeline from Iran dating back decades. It's currently stalled. I don't think probably likely to happen anytime soon, which leaves Pakistan one option in terms of importing natural gas, which is to import liquefied natural gas. So this is gas that has been cooled to a state where it's converted into a liquid. It can therefore be placed onto a tanker and sent halfway around the world. So the world's major LNG producers are the United States, Qatar, Australia, and these countries deliver many, many hundreds and thousands of miles away, including to places like Pakistan. So this is where the work that my company does comes in. So we, in 2015, commissioned Pakistan's first LNG import terminal. So this is a terminal that receives LNG from any of these international markets. And whereas LNG liquefaction is a cooling system, ours is a heating system where we take the liquefied natural gas and we heat it to turn it back into a gaseous form of natural gas and can send it into the pipeline system. So my company owns a fleet of vessels, and the one in Pakistan is moored in Port Qasim in Karachi, where again we receive liquefied natural gas and we provide it to Pakistan's system. We currently provide about 15% of Pakistan's natural gas. We have, as I mentioned, a fleet of these vessels worldwide. I guess I don't know if brag is the right word, but we do mention that our vessel in Pakistan is our most utilized worldwide. There are countries ranging from the UAE, previously Israel, who just parked these LNG receiving vessels offshore just to have another sort of energy security option. But in Pakistan, the natural gas is so needed that the vessel is operating at full capacity pretty much every day. And I know the government is very interested for us to bring a bigger vessel and also to have more LNG import terminals. So I would say, so that's where my company comes in terms of our investment. In terms of, I guess I'll perhaps save lessons learned for later, but in terms of our priorities, and I would say, what we're looking for, we'd love to increase our investment in Pakistan, notwithstanding some of the challenges of doing so. I would say the priorities we'd like to see focused on, in a general sense, are probably not very different from what most foreign investors are looking for. So less bureaucracy, simpler processes, easier permits, easier visas for our workers, for our foreign workers, easier customs, things like that, more political stability or continuity. But specifically, and I think this goes to your point when you talked about the monopoly sort of downstream, is there is also a monopoly in what I'll call the midstream. So the capacity in our terminal can only be reserved, so the ability to bring in LNG and to regasify it is reserved to state companies entirely. We'd like to see what they call in Europe and elsewhere third-party access, so the ability of private companies, those could be local domestic companies or foreign companies, to be able to reserve access in LNG import terminals so that we can bring LNG and then we can and then sell gas into the local market. That would, of course, introduce competition. If you also look at the cost of LNG, so in a, let's say, a less expensive market, one LNG cargo, and keep in mind Pakistan imports several per month, is $40 million. During the Ukraine crisis, one LNG cargo was about $100 million. So I think the ability to bring in sort of larger pools, it's not investment, but larger pools of capital and better credit would make it more possible to bring more feedstock into the Pakistani market.
Thanks for that overview, and I would invite the audience to send in any questions they might have at askac.org. I'll come back to you, Ghazala, in terms of looking at the future outlook. We've been talking about elections coming up. They're likely to happen February 11th or 8th, depending on how the hearings go, and there's different reports coming out as we speak. If you were to have a wish list of things you'd like to be seen happening in Pakistan, given the context that you just laid and all the other speakers have mentioned, what would be our 2 or 3 immediate things that you would say, you know what, again, we're in a crisis, but I view crises as opportunities in the sense, particularly as Ammar was saying this morning, they open up leapfrog opportunities for a market as well, especially a market as young as Pakistan. So what would be your sort of advice to the next set of policymakers in cabinet about dealing with this climate environment crisis, what it means for agriculture, but more importantly, access to reliable, cheap energy in Pakistan?
Yeah, so the only way I would modify your question is to say not more importantly, because, if push comes to shove, we will all live without energy. We will not live without food or water.
Correct.
Okay? So let's keep our perspective straight. First of all, I think we sometimes we don't really understand, we kind of take that for granted. Somewhere food will come from, particularly urban people, right? Food will come from somewhere, I don't need to think about it, right? Water will come from somewhere, I don't need to think about it, right? And let's urbanize more, right? Because we have to go through the structural transformation. This is an existential thing. So what was my wish list? I have a really simple wish list, right? It takes about 1% of GDP per year, 1%, okay? We currently are wasting 2.6 just on energy subsidies, another 2.6 billion on bad water and irrigation subsidies that don't go to poor farmers. It takes 1% to deliver safe water and sanitation to the entire population for about a period of 15 years. That's infra that lasts for 50 years, okay? And stunting is not an issue of hunger, guys. It is not today. It might become in the future an issue of hunger in Pakistan. It is not today. Today, it is an issue of water, sanitation, and solid waste more than anything else. It is also a food issue. Food quality is important, behavior, all this is important. But at the very foundation is, as I said, gut dysfunction, immune dysfunction that comes from a gut problem. The gut problem is a problem of water, sanitation, solid waste, untreated sewage, nitrates in fertilizers, and so forth. I just want to say that. My wish list is tightly spend a couple $2 billion a year, right? Which you have, right? The myth in Pakistan is about I don't have money, right?
I'll remind the audience again, I said this yesterday, 17.5 billion a year, according to the UNDP, go to privileged segments of Pakistani society.
I've just given you some numbers, right? All the stuff that we are spending on. So this is 1% of your GDP ain't too much, right? To get safe water, sanitation, and solid waste. We've done this stuff. By the way, that has a massive impact on GDP. So we ran it through a macro model, right? When I did the climate report, it's all there in the report. You actually, within 5 or 6 years, the return on investment is ridiculous, right? You get a massive expansion in GDP. If you're also doing a fertility decline, which we have not talked about much in the last couple of days, absolutely critical. We're at 3.3. It's ridiculous. The rest of the region is at replacement. We keep singing about our demographic dividend. It's not all a dividend, right? You're producing 65% stunted children, right? I'm really serious. 50% in Sindh are stunted. This is not a good thing. So if we worked on that, then GDP per capita skyrockets. And if this could be huge in terms of development, right? So so I just want to kind of put a corrective on where would I spend money? On human capital. That's where I would spend money first and foremost, and all of the second amount of money that's left on regenerating the environment. Because if we don't do that, we're going to be completely, done for anyway, right? We can put all we can invest on all this other stuff, we will be literally done for. And I think that people need to switch their thinking now, right? And we're not going to be done for because, the climate will change or the world won't act. We'll be done for because our environment will not be able to support life, right? So if we can sort of switch our minds on a little bit to what we are actually dealing with, I think we would have our priorities very clear in my estimation. No, I'm not saying don't do everything else. On the energy side, the government does have a really good IGCEP plan, right? The Indicated Generation Capacity Expansion Plan. Act on it, right? Yes, it'll cost something, but again, as we said, there's a lot of money
yeah.
in bad places, right? So I think we can spend that money on IGCEP, on renewables, and so forth. Massive market opportunity, I think, in renewables, right? If we just did it right. So that's my priority list.
Ammar, what about you? What's the wish list that you would have for an incoming cabinet? And I'll use a question that's also come in the chat as well, that for a lot of countries, increasingly, there's a conversation about green hydrogen as well. And that's happening. You know, countries like India are developing a policy. Is that something that is even relevant at this point in Pakistan from your point of view? So touch on that as well.
I think we've discussed a lot about green hydrogen earlier as well. One thing the state needs to understand, it cannot do everything. It's horrible at doing whatever it's doing. So maybe just take a step back and actually let people or entities or the market function in accordingly. Like as Ghazala said, sanitation. That's critical. Not a single water and sewerage board in the country is operational. KWSB, Karachi Water and Sewerage Board, the water that is charged. So that's how markets develop. Again, I just gravitate towards markets all the time. The water bill that you get at home, it's about like maybe you get like 5,000 rupees per year or 6,000 rupees per year. That does not even cover the operation and maintenance of those pipelines, of the sewage system. So what happens? You have an informal private water supplying network that's operational through tankers, through water tankers, and that obviously is supported by some people I can't really name here. So they pay a market price for water, and that market price for water is as high as any developed market in the world. So people are already paying a very high price for that. As and I said time and again, people are already paying a price, but they're not getting that service delivery in exchange. If you're paying for water, maybe you're paying something like about $1 for every 10 gallons, or for every 100, or for every 10 gallons or 100 gallons in Karachi. So people are paying a very high price, but that is not going towards institutions. That is going towards an informal market, which continues to expand.
And I'll interrupt here because that water tanker system is also inefficient because of the imported energy needs associated with moving those gallons of water on roads.
So that has a lot of externalities. You've got tankers on the roads.
And the pollution.
Road depreciation is happening. You've got diesel, they're using diesel, that's happening. While the same water can be supplied through a piped infrastructure at a much lower price, and you can essentially give clean drinking water to everyone. So that is something that can be done, and even the government does not have to put in all capital for it as well. There are public-private models that are available that can do it. Every single thing we talk about, whether that's water, whether it's public transportation, anything, the public-private models available, then they have been successfully implemented across various jurisdictions as well. That can be used and improve overall quality of life for everyone out there. So one thing that I would say, I mean, it's very difficult for anyone in the bureaucracy to really accept this, that, okay, how are we not doing this well? I think we're doing great. This is the first thing that you see when you go to Islam or the Q block or whatever.
It's the report card, Dr. Asim Khwaja.
Exactly, report that we're doing great. What are you even talking about? What do you know? Aapko kya pata hai? So, nahi pata, mere ko theek hai. So the state needs to take a step back and realize and understand that it cannot be a market player because it's horrible at being a market player. I mean, if you're good at something, fine, go ahead, do it. But if you're not good at being a market player, maybe move out. Create that enabling environment, create that enabling infrastructure that allows markets to prop up, that allows better efficiency for consumers. I'll give one small example. Alison talked about gas. So let's say you're in Karachi, you're in Port Qasim. There's an LNG terminal, Excelerate LNG ship, it's there. It got LNG at, let's say, $10. The moment that LNG enters into the state system, the distribution company system, its price increases from $10 to $14. That $14 delta is the price that you're paying for inefficiency. So if K-Electric is on the coast, why can't it use that same gas for $10? But why does everyone have to pay a cumulative penalty for inefficiency? And that's $4. So your price of gas increases by 40% just because of inefficiency. Again, two gas distribution companies, government being the ultimate buyer of gas, inefficiencies across the board.
I think you've shared this with me in a previous conversation, but for the audience's sake, if I may interrupt, you mentioned the example of Thar in that sense, right? That you cannot buy the cheapest electricity produced out of Thar to industrialize right next door. Help the audience. tell them what that's about.
So this is what it works. I think coal, we don't really talk about coal in this part of the world. It's not something that people like talking about. But let's say you've got a coal mine, and a coal mine extracts coal. It sends coal to a power plant. Now, to extract that coal, a coal mine also needs power. By the way, we can have some kind of cleaner coal as well if you start using electric vehicles, electric excavators, electric dump trucks, and so on and so forth. But that same coal mine, let's say generating electricity at a price of 1 cent per kilowatt hour. It's actually happening, generating a 1 cent. But if that coal mine wants to buy more power for itself at 1 cent, it cannot do that. Why? Because it's selling coal to a power plant. The power plant is selling that electricity to the government. The government will sell the electricity to the regional distribution company. That regional distribution company can sell it to the coal mine. So from 1 cent, the whole cycle actually increases to 20 cents. Now at 20 cents, you're like, you know what, the company goes like, okay, you know what, I'm just going to import more diesel from UAE and use that same diesel to mine coal. Does not make sense when you go mining here next to someone generating power, but you're like, no, I'm not going to buy power from you at 1 cent, I'm just going to buy power from someone else at 20 cents. And I'm going to go all the way up about like 5,000 miles away and buy diesel from them as well. Again, this is just state inefficiency and nothing else. So if the state removes itself from the picture, maybe take a step back, maybe just focus on education, health, and whatever like little it's supposed to do, rather than running electricity and every other thing in the process, maybe we will see some improvements.
Thank you for that. Erum, same question to you. What would be your wish list on the energy side post-2024 and a new cabinet? Assuming all of those things happen, we've talked about the political dynamics already, but
no, I was saying
let's get the wish list ready.
Ammar ne to state ko nikal diya, I will bring the state back in. So Ammar, and I think this is the, maybe this is why we're in different sectors, because like, I would love a world in which we don't need to deal with inefficient, misinformed, egoistic actors. Like really, believe me, that would be wonderful. We have to. This is just the reality we're in. Nobody has, if you can identify somebody who cares about poor people other than their vote, like show them to me, right? So I would love to have a world in which out of the goodness of our heart, people care about other people regardless of how much they can pay them, regardless of what they can do for them. But there's nothing else. There is a politician who wants that person's vote. That's why I'm interested in that politician. So if I had a wish list, I'd be like, get these elections done. Please, let's get on with business. Let's end this circus. I have no idea what's happening one day to the next. It is distracting. It is inefficient. It is harming the poorest and most vulnerable people.
If I may interrupt,
Yeah.
You said let's get these elections. I'm assuming, but for the audience, free and fair,
Sure.
free and fair elections.
Sure.
Talking about post-elections, what do you want?
Yeah, but
No,
but even getting them done, I'm assuming she's okay with, we're on the same page.
Do them in a convincing way. Do them in a way that there is agreement that, okay,
Correct.
fine, this was, I don't even, free and fair, my God, like what is this, right? Just do them in a way that the political actors can agree, cool, we're done, right? That is a wish list. I mean, that is genuinely something I think is holding us back, right? If we can clear that hurdle, so much else becomes, at least it starts coming into play. At least then we can start talking about things like data transparency. Tell us what the figures are on the ground. Start making good consultations with the people who've done work on this, right? If I had a wish list, once people get elected, that's when they start having sane conversations with people who have information. Right now, they are not interested in what anybody in this room is saying, and that is a tragedy to me, because there's such good work being done here. So if I really could see into the future, I would say there is so much we know now about how to better protect our communities, how to sort of, restructure our urban centers so that they are greener, that they are better for the climate. We have ways in which, I think Ammar and I were talking about this yesterday, is to take these massive electricity subsidies or fuel subsidies and increase sort of how much we're giving through BISP, right? I think we were sort of talking about this too. There are systems in place by which we can protect vulnerable communities. What would it mean if tomorrow we had massive sort of regreening sort of urban centers while we also stop needing people to to commute huge distances in order to get their work done? What if there were social safety nets, right? But all of this can only happen once we go through the painful process of elections, get just those people to agree that they're in a place where they have a 5-year outlook. Give me a 5-year outlook. Don't give me a 2-week outlook. Don't give me I don't know what's happening next month. That's not, that scares the life out of me, right? That's not something I can work with. I feel like chaos is happening. Give me somebody in power who's there for 5 years and knows that they are going to be voted out if they don't perform. That I can work with. That all of us can work with. And then I will tell them, hire whoever, man. Like call Asim Khwaja, call Asif Mia, call whoever you want. Get smart people who have done this work. Call Ghazala Mansuri. Call the people who've done this work to sit on your boards, advise your committees, tell you what to do. You know, unfortunately, I'm in the political science program, a paradigm where I think that first step is so crucial. We can't take out the state. We can't take out politics. And to me, like that would be sort of the first step.
No, thank you for that, because it's one of the things I think over lunch I was talking to a couple of people about, like top 10 key takeaways document out of this conference, and I thought number 1 would be elections. But I almost think that the elections is on itself a paragraph on its own as a prologue to the entire document, because that's been the consistent theme across conversations over the last couple of days. Alisa, I won't ask you the elections question, but you're an international participant, and you've also looked at sort of other markets like Brazil. So help the audience and help us understand what are some things that, again, markets like Brazil have done, or what you've seen in the international domain where perhaps there are lessons learned for Pakistan as it looks at sort of building resiliency in its energy ecosystem.
Sure. Well, I think in order to have a path, of course, it's important to articulate a goal. You referred to resiliency. I think that's the word of the decade. So when we think about resilient energy systems, I think there are 3 key elements. One is affordability for a country like Pakistan. I would say that's very close to the top of the list. The second is reliability. And the third is what I'll call sort of climate positivity. So whereas I think net zero is probably not realistic for Pakistan's energy system anytime soon, not to be pessimistic, I'll just be realistic, at least evolving towards a system that has less emissions than today. So again, moving away entirely, if possible, from coal, moving away from burning any kind of crude oil products, which in addition to being very bad for the environment is also very expensive. So again, these I think are the 3 goals of where probably Pakistan wants to be. As you foreshadowed, I think Brazil, again, is a good model. It's obviously in a different stage of its, let's say, energy evolution. One similarity, though, is, so as I mentioned, Pakistan is about 25% reliant on hydropower. Brazil is majority reliant on hydropower. But I think its experience, both positive and negative, with hydropower is probably what's of most relevance. So up until about a year ago, Brazil went through a period of extreme drought, whereby their hydropower production pretty much fell off of a cliff. The country would have been in a lot of trouble, but for the fact that the country, that Brazil receives pipeline imports from Bolivia, pipeline gas, again, so that's not something currently available to Pakistan, but had also leased 3 floating LNG import vessels, 2 of which, one and then later the second of which are from my company, and therefore had an alternative, had a backstop. And I do think that's a really important part of the renewables conversation. Again, when Pakistan ends up more on this trajectory, whether that's wind power, whether that's, as you referred to, solar, is that a backstop is needed when the wind doesn't blow, when the sun doesn't shine, when it sounds like there are issues around hydropower potentially in Pakistan as well, when the water doesn't flow. And I think the example to extrapolate from Brazil is the importance of having a diversified energy mix. If I can give sort of the counter example, perhaps not an example not to follow, is surprisingly comes from Germany. So Germany, I think very admirably, is well on its way towards its green energy revolution, has introduced a lot of wind power, introduced a lot of solar, and was closing coal power plants and shutting down nuclear reactors at the same time, confident that it could rely on Russian pipeline gas as the backstop for renewables. So we saw how that story ended 2 years ago. Russian pipeline gas really was no longer a reliable option for Germany. So Germany went from 0 LNG import terminals to just in the past 2 years having signed contracts for 5 and have, I think, operationalized 2, maybe 3, 5 liquefied natural gas import terminals. So I think the cautionary tale, perhaps, is not to rely on any single source, particularly as hopefully Pakistan will pivots more towards renewables.
Yeah, and I think the German case is also important in the sense that there were a lot of stories at the time of European sort of poaching buyers
Absolutely.
away, and that affecting Bangladesh and Pakistan in particular, but other emerging and developing markets as well, with the cost and going through the roof. Ammar, I'll ask you one last question because it just came into my mind, and it's a conversation that's important related to natural gas and LNG, is this whole issue of the news cycle around sort of the role of corruption and bad deals being done and things like that. Touch on that a bit, because again, you look at that market pricing function and what happens, and if others want to chime in on that question, please do so as well. But touch on that and how hurtful that conversation has been in the energy ecosystem in terms of just the instability that it has inserted into the investment cycle.
Yeah, so I think we'll have to go back a few years to understand its context. What happened was Pakistan signed long-term contracts in a market when LNG was really just picking up, and there weren't many long-term contracts around. We got a good deal out of it, around like 13% of Brent crude, which is around, in terms of energy content, the same as what's in crude. So it was a fairly balanced deal. But obviously the whole political shenanigans came into the middle, and that was considered a very bad deal. Now, again, no one really knew. A lot of noise is created, but that noise is not really backed up by actual facts. So this is what happens when there is a lot of political infighting between political parties, so on and so forth. So what happened was that just, I would say, demotivated a lot of new investment in that specific area and demotivated a lot of investment in energy, in any energy project. Because whatever happens, if someone sets a project, it's going to be like, oh, you know what, this is too expensive, this is too cheap, not understanding what the whole context is, what the context of the market is, so on and so forth. I'll just give you another example. When COVID happened, LNG was available at a very low price, around $5 per MMBTU, so on and so forth. But they're like, oh, why didn't you buy so much LNG at that point in time? People don't understand you can't just buy LNG and store it in a room. It just doesn't work like that. You need like dedicated vessels. You can't just say, okay, you know, I'll just buy LNG and maybe use it like 2 years later, like I'm using cooking oil. Just doesn't work like that. So I think it's time to maybe educate people more. And the really sad bit here is a lot of these stories were actually, propagated by former cabinet members. So, and it wasn't because of any ill will, they just did not understand any better. It's difficult to explain to someone, listen, for LNG you need a dedicated vessel. You can't just say, okay, you know what, I'm going to store LNG at my home. It just doesn't work like that. So educating them, providing the necessary guidance, providing necessary advice, maybe even just like, is like spoon feeding them at this point, policymakers, that is critical, because when this does not happen, these rumors, this noise takes a life of its own, and the whole conversation just completely changes.
Thank you for that. Any closing comments from the other panelists? I think we're also at time.
I think I'll just respond to Erum's comment regarding state. Free and fair elections is the state taking a step back.
That's a good point. It's a very diplomatically made but excellent point, and I'll give that to you. On that note, I think this brings us to the close of this last panel of our conference. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists. And this brings to an end our two-day second annual conference. Hopefully we will do one next year as well, and Kapil and I were chatting yesterday about the timing of that one. It might actually be a few weeks prior to the US elections because of how critical those will be. So I hope to see many of you in the room next year as well. And I think there have been really good themes that have emerged out of these 2 days of conversations. And what we will be doing, working with Josh and team, is to put out a top 10 takeaways document as an initial summary that can be circulated out. But then also developing, along with some support of the panelists who have joined us, including from Pakistan, a sort of short roadmap, right? Basically, as Ammar said, spoon feeding the plan, hoping somebody somewhere will read and pay attention to it. That's the most that we can do as an organization, as researchers, as people who engage with elite policymakers a lot, both here in Washington and in Islamabad and Rawalpindi. So with that note, please, thank you so much to you all for joining us, and I will look forward to staying in touch with you. Hafiz.